I had done a play in London at the Royal Court Theatre. I think it was 1985. It had been a big success. It was called Rat in the Skull. It was written by a guy who actually from Coventry, but was born in Northern Ireland, called Ron Hutchison. It was a big success, and Joe Papp, who ran the Public Theatre in New York, invited the production. And I was already in New York, ironically, because I had done another play, which the year before in London with Glenda Jackson, called Strange Interludes. So I ended up being in New York for most of 85, and I garnered some very good reviews, which was nice. I got a call from my then American agent to say that a casting director called Bonnie Timmerman would like to meet me about a project which was called, I can't remember if it was called Manhunter or it was called Red Dragon at that point. I think actually it was called Manhunter. I think they dealt with that difficulty of the title. So they said, you know, they'd like to meet you on this project. And I went along. Also, there was an actor called Brian Dennehy who had come to see my performance. I actually come to see it several times. And he was actually going to be doing, as it were, the American premiere of Rat in the Skull in Chicago. Now, little did I know that he had also been up for this role that I went up for. In fact, I have a feeling that he might have recommended me to the casting director to see me. Anyway, what happened was I got a request from this casting director to go and meet her. And they sent me some sides, some scripts, pages. And I saw that there was this scene, which was basically the scene in the cell. His first appearance. I asked the actor who I was working with, Philip Jackson, lovely, wonderful actor, English actor, and I said, Phil, would you come along and read this other part, which was the part of Will Graham? And he said, sure, I'll come along. So we went down to this audition, and we met this extraordinary woman who's still a friend to this day, diminutive kind of zealot, I could only describe her as, called Bonnie Timmerman, who turned out was really, at that time, and still is consequently, though she does more producing now, was the doyen of the sort of new wave of casting directors. And she was working with this man called Michael Mann. And Michael had done this TV series called Miami Vice, which I had not really seen, but I know it was a lot of guys unshaven and a lot of heavy music. So everybody was saying, well, this is the end, you know, he's a kind of thing. But he'd also done a film called Thief, which I had seen with Jimmy Caan, which I thought was a fantastic film. He also did a thing called The Jericho Mile, which my friend Dennehy was in. So I went along to see Bonnie, and she was this rather kind of intense, sort of big eyes, big sort of black eyes staring out at you. And in the course of the audition, she gave me the pages, and she said, would I... as we doing this and the camera was on me, she said, would I turn away from the camera? And I said, what? And I thought this is the weirdest TV audition, film audition. I've been never asked, but I was asked not to show my face to the camera. She said, no, I want you to turn away. And I said, well, why? She said, well, when I saw you, she came to see the play, she said, when I saw you in the play, I actually didn't see you because my seat wasn't a very good one. I got a seat at the last minute, and I was at the side. But I heard you, and it was your voice that sort of kind of fixed me. I said, okay. So I ended up sort of doing this, turning my back to the camera and playing the first 4 or 5 lines of this audition. And then eventually I turned in the camera, and we did this. Phil and I went and had lunch afterwards, and she, you know, the tape went off, and that was, I thought, would be the last I heard of it, you know, because I thought, well, you know, that's something that's done. So then the next 2 days, I get this call back to meet Michael Mann. So I go back and meet Michael Mann, and we talk. I thought that was definitely the end of it, because he didn't ask me to do anything, we just talked. And the next thing I knew, I was offered the role. And I subsequently found out later that there were many, many people up for this role. This was a very prized role, this character. and there was people like John Lithgow was up for it. My friend Denny was up for it. Mandy Patinkin was up for it. Subsequent to that, I met Kevin Kline, and Kevin Kline had been asked to play Will Peterson, and he turned it down. And I said, "Well, why did you turn it down?" He said, "Well, they scare me chicken shit. Those kind of movies. I can't make. They freak me out." And I said, "Oh, okay." So I got the role. They came back to me and said, "It's yours." It was quite a small part, actually. It was only, I think he's only on about 15 minutes in the film. And it's all about this, really. The prime motive of the film is to find the Tooth Fairy killer, this guy who's got a cleft palate and who's doing these whole families. I mean, that's the eeriest thing about that film, is the opening of it, when Billy Peterson goes into the house, and it's a dark house, and he just starts taking these photographs of the mayhem that's left after. It's a crime scene. And it was the first of when you think about it, it was a precursor of the whole crime scene genre of TV. I think it sort of inspired so much of what was, because that was what it was based upon, and the fact that Lektor's history and Will Graham's history is a history of cat and mouse, and they've been that he has kind of got into, that's the whole thing. He gets infected by Lektor's kind of mentality and the way Lektor is, and Lektor's spirit, as a sort of, because Lektor is a psychiatrist, but he's a highly dangerous man. And my thing was that when I read the script, Hannibal Lecter was very mysterious. You didn't know who he was. So you only had little bits, unless you read the book, and the book was a lot more clearer. But even then, he's still relatively mysterious. But the fact was that he was quite brilliant, a doctor, a man who was involved in a lot of social situations, and a man who'd been killing people, and I remember as a child reading about this guy called Peter Manuel, and Peter Manuel was somebody who kind of haunted me when I was an 11-year-old. There was a newspaper called the Sunday Pictorial, which we weren't allowed to read. The News of the World and the Sunday Pictorial were two, being brought by Catholic, there were two taboo papers. But the Pictorial was doing this coverage of this, and they weren't called serial killers. Serial killers is something it's a name that came much later. They were called mass murderers. And this guy, this little guy of Portuguese descent, who actually had been born in New York and ended up living in Glasgow. He was a tiny wee guy. He was 5'4". He's quite good looking, quite dapper, and he'd set about with this absolute mayhem of killing families, which he'd done. I mean, it was a bizarre sequence where he hired a taxi cab and someone like just outside Newcastle, killed the taxi driver, ended up going across some fields and ended up in a golf club. And then he'd murdered a girl who'd sort of strayed away from a dance at the golf club, and he ended up in Harrington, sort of decimating this family called the Smart family. So he was a sort of kind of character that I had taken from childhood, and I kind of philosophy, they have logic, they have everything as their tools, you know, to create the mayhem that they create. And it's completely without any sort of moral sensibility whatsoever. That was the thing. And also with Michael. Michael was obsessed with psychological motivation, which is it's ostensibly something which is... And Michael was interesting because he felt he'd started as a filmmaker in England. He'd studied in London, I think it was at the London Film School. He made a film called The Keep, which is a very extraordinary film. But he also did a lot of commercials. And he worked a lot with Ridley Scott, Hugh Hudson, and Alan Parker. We're all part of this very famous company. And they all individually became filmmakers in due course, but they started in commercials. And Michael had been part of that. And he tried to make a film in England, and he sort of graduated back to America. And he's from Chicago, so he came from a fairly tough neighborhood. And the interesting thing about it is that he felt that a lot of British films were weak on psychological motivation. And what he was very concerned was the psychological motivation, and particularly the motivation of somebody like a character like Hannibal. You know. So we kind of went into that a lot. You know. I was very keen that the thing about Hannibal, which was scary about him, was that we didn't know who he was. So we didn't know what his background was. We weren't sure. And it was, again, it reflects back on the mundane aspect of evil. Years later, I did a thing about Nuremberg, and so we got into evil a lot. And a lot of my ideas of the time were sort of proven by really those guys who behaved, you know, who ran the camps and the death camps and what have you. And of course, there was no real sense of who where Hannibal came from. You know, we knew this Lektor name. I wasn't sure where it was. As we were working on the thing, he was saying to me, he said, you know, the thing about Hannibal was this thing of entitlement, you know, and I agreed with that. I said he has that thing of entitlement, that he is, you know, he's empowered and entitled to be who he is. He said it reminded him, because he lived in England, and I think he may have been referring to Hugh Hudson for all I know, because Hugh Hudson is an ex-old Etonian. And he said it's that thing that's like the public schoolboy. And I think he took from his experience of working in England and the public schoolboys he'd met. And I said, well, I don't really know any public schoolboys. I said, I don't know. I said, I've known directors who've been through public school, but I don't really know very many. And then I sort of blushed, and I thought, oh, there's one I know. And I forgot that my son was at a public school, and he was at St. Paul's, and I think he was 15. He had that thing of, it was an ease about him. He was a dangerous, dangerous animal who was highly unpredictable. Because in that film, it's all about what scares you, and it's what scares you is things that lie inside you that scares you. You know, that's triggered off by other people, you know, those elements. They were filming in North Carolina at a place called Wilmington, but it wasn't going to be for actually quite a while. It wasn't going to happen until after my play had finished. I went down and spent, I think I spent altogether, I spent 10 days there, but I kind of worked. I rehearsed for 2 days, then I did some lighting tests, camera tests, and then I only filmed over another 2 days, so it was a lot of time hanging about. I remember rehearsing with Billy Peterson. We rehearsed on this kind of bayou, which was a house that I think Michael Mann had, which was surrounded by crocodiles, because it was right in that sort of fierce part of that part of Carolina, North Carolina. So we shot the film, and it was, you know, I worked with the great Dante Spinotti, who shot it. I never had so many lights in my face, and we literally had a whole barrage of lights here and lights there. In fact, I could hardly see Bill Peterson, you know, because the light was in my face. It was so white, and it was a white set. And the one thing I kept in from the thing was his first appearance, which was actually inspired by Bonnie. In fact, couldn't see me, so I'm actually start with my face away from the camera. And he says, I recognize the smell.
You wore in court 3 years ago.
Aftershave that he's wearing.
Yeah, I keep getting it for Christmas.
And it's got the little ship on the bottom. I thought, is really Will Graham an Old Spice man? I wonder. Anyway, that was the idea, that he recognized him from before he saw him because of the smell. And of course that's part of Lektor's acuteness, the kind of sensitivity that he's got, in one sense. He's an interesting character, Michael. He's typical of directors, that there's that kind of monomania thing, you know, which it sort of goes with the territory. There's no judgment in that. It's just the way it is, you know. It creates that sort of power thing. And of course he shoots, as I say, he shot the shit out of it, because he's looking at every aspect visually, how to make it work within the confines of the fact that it's a very tight screen, really, you know, because it's just that white cell. And that was a kind of design thing. We had Woody Allen's designer, Mel Bourne, I think. Mel Bourne is his name. We worked on the set, and then Dante kept bringing in more and more lights, and he wanted whiter and whiter and whiter. Michael's obsession with Hockney, there's an element of Hockney in that movie, and you see it particularly in Heat. Heat's a very Hockney-esque, because those kind of West Coast Los Angeles blues, those dark blues that are used, are very Hockney-like. Michael is being primarily kind of, I think he's a bit of a painter in many ways. He saw these were the tones that he was using, to great effect, I think, in Heat, and also in Animal. The thing I think dates the movie more than anything else, apart from possibly the clothes a little bit, is the music. I've always felt that, that I wouldn't change one frame, but I would change the music. I would rethink the score because I do think that's very much part of that thing. And it's amazing how much music dates more than anything else. You know, you can almost hear something, you can actually place it to the year that it was done. Whereas other elements of the film are not like that, you know. But that's again the taste of the time and who you're working with, you know. The great thing about Bill, and we met subsequently, not a lot, but over the years, is that we're both theatre animals. So we really understood the advantage of getting the shape of the scene right, and theatrically, in terms of speed. What I'm proudest of is our speed. And speed comes from intelligence. The fact that they're quick thinking all the time. They're trying to outsmart one another. They're trying to trick one another. And Bill immediately got into that. We immediately fell into that flow. And it really was. You know, he ran his own theatre company. He was ostensibly a theatre animal who'd fallen into, happily fallen in movies. He'd worked with Billy Friedkin, which was how he got the part, because as I say, I think a few people had been up for that role, and they cast Billy, who was relatively unknown, apart from he'd just done this film To Live and Die in L.A. with Bill Friedkin, and it was Billy Friedkin who recommended him to Michael and said he's wonderful, and he was. And in fact, the more I see the film, the more I realize what a great performance his performance is. He had to follow certain aspects of the look, which I don't think was altogether Bill's idea, which was Michael's idea. You know, the actual, you know, the unshaven thing, which was all part of the Miami Vice thing. It was all part of that. There was a zeitgeist of the time for being slightly unshaven, and, you know, which has hung with us ever since. You know, this kind of unshaven look. But that was really where it started. It started in Miami Vice. There's an element in it, and the design of his clothes. There was a sequence where I had to talk to him on the phone, and I just, you know, and I had the line, "I just called," and I immediately, when we filmed it, I went off doing Stevie Wonder, "I Just Called to Say I Love You," and of course Michael loved this. He thought it was tremendous. So Hannibal Lecter still singing a Stevie Wonder song to his arch nemesis, and it was in the film for a while, but I think they had problems with rights. Well, actually, I think they had problems with association, that this mass killer would be singing a Stevie Wonder song. But anyway, it never got used, and I think it became too expensive, and I also think probably the Stevie Wonder people probably didn't like the idea that I was going to be singing this song with a kind of twisted attitude towards it. But it was fun, you know. It was very liberating, and you know, it was great because, you know, Michael was, you know, he was, you know, once he learned to trust me, you know, and that's what, you know, that's always the dance you do with directors in the beginning of a movie, where they're, you know, sometimes they micromanage, sometimes they over control, but if they learn to touch, the good ones learn to trust you, they let you go, and then therefore you can go into free flow and start doing adding all kinds of little, you know, grace notes to a performance, and that was one of them, which unfortunately, and I don't think it was, I think Michael would have liked it, but I think it was rights and the association of the song in a negative way that didn't make it to the final cut. That's okay. That's part of it, really. There are many, many fine performances in that film. Tommy Noonan, I think, is as scary as anything. You know, Tommy Noonan as Dolarhyde, it's a magnificent performance. And again, you know, not a performance that a lot of people kind of talked about, but I think he's the really scary thing in that movie, you know, because of his gentleness, and he's really downright creepy. And then all those scenes with Joan Allen were incredibly good, you know, Joan Allen as the blind lady. And of course, lovely Dennis Farina, the late, sadly, Dennis Farina, who literally had been a Chicago cop, was a Chicago cop when we shot it. And after that film, he said, "I got a feeling I can go and hang up my cuffs." He said he hung up his cuffs, which was meant that he finally retired from the Chicago. He was on the robbery squad, I think, and he finally retired from the Chicago police force after that. And Bill, of course, as well, Bill Peterson. Kim Greist, she went on to make Brazil and stuff like that. So there was a sort of, within the industry, there was a kind of there was a lot of heat around the movie, and then especially when it came out again, and it kept popping back up, it was greeted with really very favourable thing. But the problem was that it was De Laurentiis. De Laurentiis went bankrupt, and the film lay in escrow for a long time. So he couldn't honour his screens, so we couldn't get it to the screens. So the film opened, and it opened to pretty damn good notices, and people watched it. But then it disappeared. Then it didn't go into the cinemas, and because, you know, all the investment that, I mean, I don't know quite what the financial story was, but the fact that the idea, you know, that De Laurentiis had this idea. I mean, he made The Year of the Dragon, because the sets were still standing, I remember, for The Year of the Dragon, that Mickey Rourke film, on the lot when I was filming in Wimbledon. And he had this idea, which was a laudable idea, of moving Hollywood to, you know, North Carolina. But the problem is, he forgot about hurricanes. You know, he forgot that it's not a great spot. I think De Laurentiis put all his eggs in one basket, and he always had he was not very, I mean, he was very happy about the film when we made it. He was very happy about the reviews, but he was very unhappy about the fact that the film represented to him his downfall and his fortune. So he was never very pro Manhunter, and kind of would like it not to have existed, I think, because it represented a bad time in his life. So the film fell into, well, you know, they did it. I mean, it did initially very well, and then it didn't get the screenings because it was in escrow, because it was part of a whole bankruptcy thing. I think it was in 1989. I think it was finally released in the UK. Late 88 or 89, I can't remember which. I think it was 89. And it was Jeremy Thomas, who I think knew Michael, because I think he was part of that scene in the early days. And he decided to release it in England, and it did very well. It was released here, and people took notice of it, and I did incredibly well out of the film. And in fact, I was getting wooed to go to Hollywood, really, to spend more time in Hollywood, around about when that film was released, when it was first released. And I actually couldn't, because I was going through a divorce. So I'd committed myself to being in the theatre back in the UK, so I never got back to Hollywood. You know, I remember receiving the original drafts of Silence of the Lambs, which Tom Harris sent me. And he sent it to me saying, "This is my next book, and I hope that you will take part." And now this was years before, at least 5 years before the film. This is about 87, 88. So I read this thing thinking, wow, you know, and of course in that, there was still this element of, you know, he'd gone and he was with this young woman. So there was a sort of sexual element to it, which was really interesting, kind of frisson. And also the fact that he was still a mysterious figure. He was still someone who we didn't know. We were learning a little more about, but he still maintained that mystery that made him really scary. And then, of course, the rest is history, you know. There's also a problem about the name, because there's different spellings of the name. I think it's spelt one way, and because I remember when the second script came out, if I remember rightly, the character was not called Hannibal Lecter. He was called something else. And there was a suit. I think Michael, for some unknown reason, had the rights to the name of Hannibal, even though he was called Hannibal Lecter in the book. It was about the spelling, I think. And I think he was called Quigley or something like that. But the interesting story about The Silence of the Lambs is the person who had the option on it to direct it was Gene Hackman. He had an option to direct it, and he was going to direct it for a long time. And I don't know what happened. And he was, I think, was thinking of doing it with Robert Duvall as Hannibal Lecter. I got that impression. That was the idea behind it. And maybe that may be apocryphal, all of that. But that was the thing that came back to me, because I wondered what had happened to this project. When I got the proof pages of Silence of the Lambs, I thought, oh, what's happened to it? And it kind of went through many shapes and all. De Laurentiis, of course, still had the rights to Tom's work. And, of course, he produced the films, and, of course, he made a fortune out of The Silence of the Lambs, because it went global. I remember when I did Hannibal, I was doing Hannibal, and Tony Hopkins, he was playing King Lear, and I was doing Hannibal Lecter. And when this thing came along, and I remember my agent saying, "I've been sent a script, and it's very like that script," and that's why I think in the script he wasn't called Hannibal, he was called something else. He said, "There's a character that's very similar to that character you played in that film, Manhunter." And I didn't think any more about it. And he says, "It's been sent for Tony." And I didn't give it a second thought. And then I realized that they were making The Silence of the Lambs, and it was going to be, it was Jonathan Demme And he wanted to start with his own sheet and start with Tony, and well, the rest is history. And I think that Tony brought this tremendous, I mean, very effective theatricality to the role, which is not my line on it, but it was still very effective. And it hit a kind of, you know, it kind of marked with an audience because of its kind of grand guignol aspect of it. And rightly a success. It's a fantastically well-made film, but it's again a Gothic film. It's very much in the Gothic tradition of horror films. It's not what Michael's film was, which was very clinical and really white and an absolute study. You know, where a speck of blood on a white surface suddenly meant something huge, as opposed to blood all over the place. You know, and carnage. So it became that kind of movie, and which was legitimate. You know, I mean, I had no, you know, I would have liked to play the role, yes, of course, but I didn't have any possession on it. It was a sort of real experience working on that film, because it's very satisfying, very gratifying, you know, and Michael was he was a very freeing director, as was Dante in terms of the filming, and you knew that you were being shot in a very brilliant way. You know, you knew you were in the hands of in terms of the look of it, a genius. The elements, of course, as I say, that the interesting thing is, we were saying earlier, that has made the film. I mean, I personally I'm not mad about the music, but then I'm not mad about the 80s music. I didn't like that, or even a lot of the 80s clothes. There's not too much of that in the film, you know. It's a little bit, but there's not too many padded shoulders, you know. Bill has one jacket which is slightly sort of over padded in the shoulders, but and then loose elsewhere, you know. It's kind of weird. But the music, I mean, I'd love to see that film. I'd love to see it redone with a different score, but then ironically, it's the score that kind of places it incredibly well. So that's part of the legacy of the movie now, you know. And subsequently, of course, it's a bit like Hamlet, you know. There've been many Hannibal Lectors, you know, and there'll be many more, and they'll revive the franchise, and somebody else will play it, and it'll be a bit like James Bond's, you know, all of that. Now that Mad Nicholson does it on the television, Tony's done it, and I think there was even a film about a young Hannibal Lecter at one time. So it's become a sort of institution, which of course, when I was involved with it, it never was. It was fledgling. It was completely embryonic, you know. But it was interesting to see the development. My feeling about Tom and my feeling about, in a sense, is, you know, you start to give them a background, and you start to do, because the problem when you give them a background is you rationalize them. You know, that's always the problem. That's always the danger. And of course, we do that in life. We have to try and understand what motivates people. But unfortunately, in drama, it kind of weakens the effect that somebody like Hannibal has, you know. And I think that's what happened. That we went into films where it just suddenly became slightly preposterous, the sort of examination of who he is and who he was and what he did, which, as an actor, I would totally go along with, but at the same time, it's not as effective dramatically as that thing, as the bogeyman who in the dark, you know. And I think in a way, arguing against myself, I think in a way that's a logical, you know, that's a logical thing, is that we really begin to understand how we are in relationship to the horrific acts that human beings can do. There's no question about it. Hannibal Lecter became my calling card, you know, because A, I was in the original, and B, I was the original. I was the first, you know. So it suddenly became a calling card for me, which was quite interesting. Years later, I mean, you know, people still talk about it. David Milch, when I first met him, still talks about that film. And that film influenced a lot of people, you know, just in its audacity, certainly in its style, and certainly in its filmic style.
I'm finished.
You want the scent? Smell yourself.